The humid air of a late August afternoon in 2008 hung thick and heavy over the manicured lawns of Oakhaven, a sleepy suburban town nestled in the heart of Ohio. It was the kind of oppressive heat that seemed to swallow sound, where the drone of a distant lawnmower was a familiar and comforting anchor to the rhythm of a lazy Saturday. For the residents of Maple Street, that anchor was the near-religious weekend ritual of 72-year-old Arthur Art Jenkins, a man whose love for his pristine yard was as well known as his friendly wave. But on this particular Saturday, the familiar hum of Art's trusty red lawnmower sputtered, coughed, and then fell silent, leaving a void that would stretch into an agonizing 15-year mystery. The sudden quiet was unsettling, a stark contrast to the usual symphony of suburban life. It was a silence that would soon be filled with the frantic calls of his wife, the worried chatter of neighbors, and eventually, the blare of police sirens. Eleanor Jenkins, Art's wife of 50 years, was in the kitchen preparing a pitcher of her famous iced tea, the condensation beading on the glass in the sweltering heat. She had always joked that Art's lawnmower was his second wife, a demanding partner that required his unwavering attention every weekend. She'd heard the mower's engine die before, of course. It was an old machine, prone to fits and starts, but this time was different. A strange, prickling unease crept up her spine as the minutes ticked by and the familiar roar didn't resume. She wiped her hands on her apron, her heart beginning to beat a little faster, and peered out the kitchen window. The sight that greeted her would be seared into her memory forever. The red lawnmower sitting, abandoned in the middle of a lawn, a silent crimson sentinel under the blistering afternoon sun. Her initial calls for Art went unanswered, her voice swallowed by the oppressive stillness. Stepping out onto the back patio, the heat rising from the flagstones in shimmering waves, Eleanor felt a growing knot of dread in her stomach. The scent of freshly cut grass, usually a source of simple pleasure, now seemed cloying and sinister. She walked the perimeter of the yard, her voice growing more frantic with each unanswered shout of his name. The neatly trimmed hedges and vibrant flower beds that Art had so lovingly tended to now felt like a mocking testament to his sudden and inexplicable absence. Everything was in its place, except for the man who had created this small suburban paradise. The neighbors, drawn by Eleanor's increasingly distressed cries, began to emerge from their air-conditioned homes. They stood in small, bewildered clusters on their own perfectly manicured lawns, their faces etched with concern. They offered comforting words and theories, each one more far-fetched than the last. Had he gone for a walk to cool off? Perhaps he'd felt unwell and sought shade in the nearby woods that bordered their properties. But as the afternoon bled into evening and the long shadows of the oak trees stretched across the abandoned lawn, a collective and unspoken fear began to take root. Art Jenkins was not the kind of man to simply wander off. He was a man of routine, a man of habit, a man who, until that day, had always been as constant as the summer sun itself. The arrival of the Oakhaven Police Department marked the official start of the investigation, transforming the quiet suburban street into a hub of flashing lights and crackling radios. The officers, accustomed to dealing with minor disputes and the occasional lost pet, were initially stumped. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses who had seen anything out of the ordinary, and no immediate indication of foul play. The scene was eerily sterile, a domestic tableau frozen in time. The half-mown lawn, the abandoned pitcher of iced tea on the kitchen counter, the faint smell of gasoline lingering in the air. Each detail was a frustratingly mundane clue in a puzzle that had no logical solution. The initial search of the immediate area, including the dense woods behind the Jenkins home, yielded nothing. As darkness fell, a sense of grim reality settled over the neighborhood. The search parties, a mix of police officers and concerned neighbors, fanned out into the surrounding area, their flashlights cutting feeble beams through the inky blackness. They called his name until their voices were hoarse, the sound echoing through the still night air. But the only response was the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. The community held its breath, a collective hope that with the dawn would come answers, that Art would be found safe, perhaps disoriented but otherwise unharmed. But as the sun rose on a new day, casting a golden glow on the still unfinished lawn, the silence remained deeper and more profound than before. In the days that followed, the search for Art Jenkins intensified, drawing in volunteers from across the state and capturing the attention of the local media. His face, a kind and grandfatherly visage with a warm, easy smile, was plastered on flyers and broadcast on the evening news. The story of the grandfather who vanished while mowing his lawn became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors. Detectives interviewed Eleanor, their children, and every friend and acquaintance they could find, meticulously piecing together the life of a man who seemed to have no enemies and no reason to disappear. Yet every lead they pursued, every theory they explored, led them to a frustrating dead end. The investigation stretched into weeks, then months, and eventually, years. The half-mown lawn was eventually finished by a neighbor, a somber act of solidarity that spoke volumes. Eleanor, her heart heavy with a grief that had no closure, eventually sold the house, unable to bear the constant, silent reminder of that fateful August afternoon. The red lawnmower, once a symbol of Art's weekend devotion, was given away, its engine never to be heard on Maple Street again. The case of Art Jenkins grew cold, a file gathering dust in the archives of the Oakhaven Police Department, another unsolved mystery in a world full of them. The memory of Art Jenkins, however, did not fade entirely. For the longtime residents of Maple Street, his disappearance remained a haunting presence, a ghost that lingered in the summer heat and the smell of freshly cut grass. New families moved in, children grew up, and the rhythms of suburban life continued. But for those who remembered that sweltering August day, the silence left by the sputtering lawnmower never truly went away. It was a silence that held a question that would lie dormant for 15 long years, waiting for the day when the earth itself would finally be ready to give up its secrets. And so, the stage was set for a discovery that would shatter the tranquility of Oakhaven once more. A discovery that would unearth a truth far more shocking and sinister than anyone could have ever imagined. The quiet suburban street, with its idyllic homes and perfectly manicured lawns, held a dark secret, buried just beneath the surface. The mystery of what happened to Arthur Jenkins was far from over. In fact, the most terrifying chapter was yet to begin. The neighbors, in an act of community and remembrance, had no idea that their simple gesture would unearth a horror that had lain hidden for over a decade. To understand the depth of the void left by Art Jenkins' disappearance, one must first understand the man himself. Arthur was a creature of habit, a man who found comfort and purpose in the simple, predictable rhythms of life. Born and raised in Oakhaven, he had worked for 40 years as an accountant at the local paper mill, a job that suited his meticulous and steady nature. He was a man who believed in order, in balanced ledgers, and neatly trimmed hedges. His life was a testament to this belief, a carefully constructed edifice of routine and responsibility. His sudden vanishing was not just an absence. It was a disruption of the natural order of things, a tear in the very fabric of the community he had called home for his entire life. Art's relationship with his wife, Eleanor, was the bedrock of his existence. They had met in high school, their love story, a classic small-town romance that had weathered the storms of life for half a century. They were a familiar sight in Oakhaven, holding hands during their evening strolls, their gentle laughter a comforting soundtrack to the twilight hours. Eleanor had always been the more spontaneous of the two, her adventurous spirit a perfect counterbalance to Art's cautious nature. She was the one who encouraged him to travel, to try new things, but Art was always happiest at home, in the familiar embrace of his house, his garden, and his beloved wife. His devotion to her was absolute, a quiet but powerful force that everyone who knew them could feel. Their 2 children, Michael and Sarah, had long since grown up and moved away, creating lives of their own in bustling cities far from the quiet confines of Oakhaven. They remembered their father as a kind and patient man, a source of unwavering support and quiet wisdom. Michael, a successful lawyer, recalled his father's gentle guidance, the way he would patiently explain complex problems until they seemed simple. Sarah, a teacher, spoke of his unwavering belief in her, his quiet pride in her accomplishments. They painted a picture of a devoted family man, a man who had given them a happy and secure childhood, a man with no dark secrets or hidden demons. The Jenkins home on Maple Street was a reflection of Art's personality, neat, orderly, and meticulously maintained. Every tool in his garage had its designated place. Every book on his shelves was arranged in alphabetical order. His greatest pride and joy, however, was his lawn. It was a lush, emerald carpet, a testament to his tireless efforts and unwavering dedication. Mowing the lawn was not a chore for Art, it was a form of meditation, a way to bring order to a small corner of the world. He would spend hours on his trusty red lawnmower, his face a mask of concentration, his movements precise and methodical. The perfectly straight lines he carved into the grass were a source of deep satisfaction for him. Despite his quiet and reserved nature, Art was a beloved figure in the neighborhood. He was always ready with a friendly wave, a warm smile, or a helping hand. He was the one who would lend a neighbor a tool, offer advice on gardening, or help a stranded motorist. He was a pillar of the community, a man who embodied the values of kindness, generosity, and neighborliness. His disappearance sent a shockwave through the tight-knit community, a reminder that even in the safest of places, darkness could lurk just beneath the surface. The empty house on Maple Street became a somber landmark, a constant reminder of the man who had vanished without a trace. In the initial days of the investigation, detectives had explored every possible avenue. They had considered the possibility of a medical emergency, that Art had suffered a heart attack or a stroke and wandered off in a state of confusion. But a thorough search of the nearby woods and a check of all local hospitals had yielded no results. They had also looked into the possibility that he had simply walked away from his life, that the pressures of his quiet existence had become too much to bear. But his family and friends vehemently dismissed this theory, insisting that Art was a happy and contented man who would never have abandoned his beloved Eleanor. The investigation had also delineated a more sinister possibility: foul play. Detectives had interviewed known criminals in the area, checked for any recent parolees, and explored the possibility of a random act of violence. But with no witnesses, no physical evidence, and no apparent motive, this line of inquiry had also led to a dead end. The case of Art Jenkins was a frustrating and perplexing puzzle, a mystery with no clear solution. The lack of any credible leads had left the investigators with a sense of profound unease, a feeling that they were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. As the years passed, the official investigation into Art's disappearance wound down, the case relegated to the cold case files. But for Eleanor and her children, the search for answers never ended. They hired private investigators, consulted with psychics, and made numerous public appeals for information. They clung to the hope that one day they would receive a phone call, a letter, a sign that would finally explain what had happened to their beloved husband and father. But the years stretched on, each one bringing fresh waves of grief and a deepening sense of despair. The not knowing, they would later say, was the cruelest form of torture. The community of Oakhaven, too, never forgot Art Jenkins. Every year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, a small memorial would be held in the local park, a gathering of friends and neighbors who refused to let his memory fade. They would share stories of his kindness, his generosity, and his unwavering love for his family and his community. They would light candles and offer prayers, their collective hope a small flicker of light in the darkness of the unknown. The story of the grandfather who vanished while mowing his lawn had become a part of the town's folklore, a sad and cautionary tale that was passed down from one generation to the next. And so, for 15 years, the mystery of Art Jenkins' disappearance remained unsolved, a gaping wound in the heart of a small Ohio town. The silence that had fallen over Maple Street on that hot August afternoon had never truly been broken. It was a silence that held the weight of a family's grief, a community's sorrow, and a question that had no answer. But the earth, as it turned out, had been a silent witness to the events of that day, and it was only a matter of time before it would be forced to give up its long-held secrets, revealing a truth that was more shocking and horrifying than anyone could have ever imagined. In the spring of 2023, 15 years after Art Jenkins had vanished into thin air, a young couple, Tom and Sarah Miller, bought the old Jenkins house on Maple Street. They were newcomers to Oakhaven, drawn by the promise of a quiet life, a safe place to raise their 2 young children. They were unaware of the house's tragic history, of the ghost that still lingered in the summer air. The real estate agent, eager to make a sale, had conveniently omitted the story of the grandfather who had disappeared while mowing the lawn. To the Millers, it was just a charming old house with a big backyard, a perfect place to put down roots and create new memories. The house had been well maintained over the years, passed from one owner to another, each one leaving their own small mark on the property. But the backyard, once Art Jenkins' pride and joy, had been somewhat neglected. The lawn was patchy and uneven. The flower beds were overgrown with weeds, and the old oak tree in the corner seemed to cast a long and somber shadow over the entire property. Sarah, an avid gardener, saw the yard as a blank canvas, a project that she could pour her heart and soul into. She envisioned a vibrant and colorful oasis, a place where her children could play and laugh, a place filled with life and light. Tom, a construction worker, was more than happy to help his wife bring her vision to life. They spent their first few weekends in the new house clearing out the overgrown brush, pulling up weeds, and tilling the soil. It was hard work, but they were filled with the excitement and optimism of new beginnings. As they worked, they began to unearth small, forgotten treasures: a rusty old horseshoe, a collection of colorful marbles, a child's faded toy soldier. Each discovery was a small glimpse into the lives of the families who had lived in the house before them, a reminder that they were now part of a long and unfolding story. One sunny Saturday afternoon, as Tom was digging up a particularly stubborn patch of weeds near the old oak tree, his shovel hit something hard. He assumed it was just a large rock, a common obstacle in the clay-rich soil of Ohio. But as he continued to dig, he realized that the object was too smooth, too uniform to be a rock. A flicker of curiosity tinged with a strange sense of unease sparked within him. He called Sarah over, and together they began to carefully excavate the area, their initial excitement slowly giving way to a growing sense of trepidation. The earth, it seemed, was not ready to give up its secrets easily. As they dug deeper, the object began to take on a more defined shape. It was long and cylindrical, wrapped in what appeared to be a thick, weathered tarp. A strange, metallic glint caught the sunlight, sending a shiver down Tom's spine. A sense of dread, cold and sharp, began to seep into the warm afternoon air. They exchanged a nervous glance, their shared excitement now replaced by a silent and unspoken fear. They knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were on the verge of a discovery that would change their lives, and the lives of everyone in Oakhaven, forever. They were no longer just digging up a garden. They were unearthing a secret that had been buried for 15 long years, with trembling hands. They carefully unwrapped the tarp, their hearts pounding in their chests. The object that was revealed was not a treasure, not a relic from a bygone era. It was a long metal box, its surface rusted and pitted with age. It was a toolbox, the kind that Art Jenkins had been known to use, a detail that would later send a fresh wave of grief through his family. But it was what was inside the toolbox that would turn their quiet suburban dream into a living nightmare. The contents were not tools, not the mundane implements of a weekend gardener. They were the skeletal remains of a human being, a discovery that would shatter the peace of Maple Street and reopen a wound that had never truly healed. The Millers, their faces pale with shock and horror, stumbled back from the shallow grave, their dream of a quiet life shattered in an instant. The scent of the freshly turned earth, once so full of promise, now seemed to anoint the air with the stench of death and decay. The sounds of their children playing in the front yard, a joyous and innocent sound just moments before, now seemed jarring and out of place. They had unwittingly unearthed a tomb, a secret that had been silently waiting just beneath the surface, for someone to come along and disturb its long and lonely slumber. The ghost of Art Jenkins had finally made its presence known, and its story was far more terrifying than anyone could have ever imagined. The call to the Oakhaven Police Department was made in a state of near hysteria. The dispatcher at first thought it was a prank, a sick joke, but the genuine terror in Sarah's voice soon convinced her otherwise. Within minutes, the quiet suburban street was once again filled with the flashing lights and blaring sirens of police cars, a chilling echo of that fateful August afternoon 15 years earlier. The neighbors, drawn by the commotion, gathered in bewildered clusters, their faces a mixture of curiosity and fear. They watched as the police cordoned off the Millers' backyard, their idyllic new home, now a designated crime scene. The discovery of the human remains in the backyard of the old Jenkins house sent a shockwave of horror and disbelief through the community of Oakhaven. The long-dormant case of the missing grandfather was suddenly and violently resurrected, casting a dark and sinister shadow over the town. The old-timers, the ones who had known and loved Art Jenkins, felt a fresh wave of grief, a painful reopening of a wound that had never truly healed. The newcomers, like the Millers, were forced to confront the dark and unsettling history of their quiet suburban town, a history that was far more complex and disturbing than they had ever imagined. The investigation into the death of the person whose remains were found in the metal toolbox was now a full-blown homicide investigation. The quiet suburban street, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, was now the center of a media frenzy. News vans and reporters descended upon Oakhaven, their cameras and microphones eager to capture every detail of the gruesome discovery. The story of the grandfather who vanished while mowing his lawn had taken a dark and sinister turn, and the whole world was now watching, waiting to see what other secrets the earth of Maple Street would be forced to reveal. The uneasy ground had finally given up its dead, and the true horror of what had happened to Art Jenkins was about to be exposed. The arrival of the forensic team transformed the miller's backyard into a sterile and meticulous grid of scientific inquiry. The vibrant green lawn, once a symbol of new beginnings, was now a canvas of yellow police tape and small, numbered evidence markers. The scent of blooming roses, which Sarah had so carefully planted, was now overpowered by the acrid, chemical smell of luminol and the faint, yet unmistakable odor of decay that seemed to cling to the humid air. Every shovelful of earth was carefully sifted, every root and stone examined with a level of scrutiny that spoke to the gravity of the discovery. The skeleton in the garden had a story to tell, and these silent white-coated figures were its interpreters. Dr. Anya Sharma, the county medical examiner, a woman with a calm and reassuring demeanor that belied the often gruesome nature of her work, oversaw the exhumation. Her team worked with a quiet reverence, a respectful silence that acknowledged the sanctity of the human remains they were so carefully unearthing. As the last of the dirt was brushed away, the full skeleton was revealed, its bones stained a dark, earthy brown from its long interment. It was positioned in a fetal position, crammed into the confines of the metal toolbox with a chilling and brutal efficiency. The sight was a stark and brutal reminder of the violence that had shattered the peace of this quiet suburban neighborhood so many years ago. The initial examination of the skeletal remains, conducted right there in the makeshift grave, revealed several key details. The victim was a male, likely in his late 60s or early 70s, a fact determined by the wear and tear on the bones and the presence of degenerative joint disease. This preliminary assessment sent a ripple of confirmation through the assembled officers. The age range was a perfect match for Art Jenkins. The remains also showed signs of significant trauma. There were multiple fractures to the skull, clear evidence of a violent and brutal attack. The cause of death, it seemed, was not a mystery. This was not a case of a man who had simply wandered off and succumbed to the elements. This was a murder. The discovery of a small, tarnished object clutched in the skeletal hand of the victim provided the first tangible link to Art Jenkins. It was a silver locket, a heart-shaped pendant that Eleanor Jenkins had given to her husband on their 40th wedding anniversary. She had described it to the police in heartbreaking detail in the initial days of the investigation, her voice thick with unshed tears. The locket, with its faded inscription, "Always and Forever," was a poignant and tragic symbol of a love that had been so cruelly cut short. The confirmation that the remains were, in fact, those of Arthur Jenkins, brought a fresh wave of grief to his family, a painful end to 15 years of agonizing uncertainty. Back at the lab, a more detailed analysis of the remains began to paint an even grittier and more disturbing picture of Art's final moments. The fractures to his skull were consistent with being struck multiple times with a blunt object, an object with a distinct and recognizable shape. The forensic anthropologists, piecing together the shattered fragments of bone, were able to create a 3D model of the weapon, a tool that would prove to be a crucial piece of the puzzle. The brutality of the attack suggested a crime of passion, a burst of rage that had quickly escalated into a fatal and irreversible act. The idyllic image of the quiet, friendly grandfather was now irrevocably intertwined with the grim reality of a violent and bloody murder. The metal toolbox in which Dart's body had been concealed also provided a wealth of forensic evidence. Fingerprints, long preserved in the cool, dark earth, were lifted from its rusted surface. DNA evidence, in the form of skin cells and hair follicles, was carefully collected from the interior. The toolbox itself was a common brand, a popular model that could have been purchased at any hardware store in the country, but a small, almost imperceptible scratch on its side, a unique and identifying mark, would become a key piece of evidence in the hunt for Art's killer. Every detail, no matter how small, was now a potential clue, a breadcrumb on the long and winding path to justice. The news that the remains found in the miller's backyard belonged to Art Jenkins sent a fresh wave of shock and sadness through Oak Haven. The memorial in the park, once a symbol of hope, now became a place of mourning. The community gathered, their faces etched with a mixture of grief and a quiet, simmering anger. They had mourned Art's absence for 15 years, but now they were forced to confront the horrific reality of his death. The question that had haunted them for so long had finally been answered, but the answer was far more terrible than they could have ever imagined. The grandfather who had vanished while mowing his lawn had been murdered, his body buried just a few feet from where his family had so desperately searched for him. For Eleanor Jenkins, now in her late 80s and living in a quiet retirement community, the news was a devastating blow. The faint hope that she had clung to for so long, the hope that Art was still alive somewhere, was now extinguished. But with the grief came a new and steely resolve. She wanted justice for her husband, for the kind and gentle man who had been so brutally taken from her. She provided the police with a detailed list of everyone who had known Art, everyone who had been a part of their lives. Her mind a sharp and clear repository of memories from a happier time. She was determined to help them find the person who had shattered her world so completely. The investigation, now officially a homicide case, was infused with a new sense of urgency. The cold case files were reopened, the old witness statements re-examined in the harsh light of the new evidence. The detectives, a new generation of officers who had grown up with the legend of the missing grandfather, felt a personal connection to the case. They were determined to succeed where their predecessors had failed, to finally bring closure to a family and a community that had been living in the shadow of this mystery for far too long. The skeleton in the garden had given them a name, a cause of death, and a wealth of new evidence. The hunt for Art Jenkins' killer had officially begun. The media frenzy surrounding the case reached a fever pitch. The story of the grandfather, who was murdered and buried in his own backyard, was a sensational and compelling narrative, a story that captured the public's imagination. The pressure on the Oak Haven Police Department was immense, the whole world now watching and waiting for an arrest. The detectives worked around the clock, fueled by a potent cocktail of coffee, adrenaline, and a fierce determination to bring a killer to justice. The quiet town of Oak Haven had become the epicenter of a real-life murder mystery, and the final, shocking chapter was about to unfold. With the confirmation that the remains belonged to Art Jenkins, the investigation pivoted, turning its focus from the what to the who. The cold case files, thick with the dust of 15 years, were brought out into the stark, fluorescent light of the Oak Haven Police Department's incident room. Every page, every note, every witness statement was re-examined with fresh eyes, seen through the new and horrifying lens of a brutal homicide. The detectives, led by the sharp and tenacious detective Isabella Rossi, a woman who had grown up hearing the local legend of the vanishing grandfather, began the painstaking process of resurrecting the past. They were no longer searching for a missing person. They were hunting a killer who had walked among them, hidden in plain sight, for over a decade. The initial interviews from 2008 painted a picture of a close-knit, almost idyllic neighborhood. Neighbors had spoken of Art in glowing terms, describing him as a kind, gentle soul, the unofficial patriarch of Maple Street. They had all been home on that fateful Saturday, the drone of Art's lawnmower, a familiar backdrop to their weekend routines. But when questioned about the moment the mower fell silent, their accounts became hazy, their memories blurred by the passage of time and the mundane nature of the day. No one had seen anything unusual, no strange cars, no unfamiliar faces. The killer, it seemed, had been a ghost, slipping in and out of the suburban landscape without leaving a single ripple. Detective Rossi and her team began the arduous task of re-interviewing everyone who had lived on Maple Street in 2008. Some had moved away, their lives taking them to different states, different countries. Others had passed away, taking their memories with them to the grave. But for those who remained, the news of the discovery in the Jenkins' old backyard brought the events of that day rushing back with a startling and often painful clarity. The whispers of yesterday, once faint and indistinct, began to grow louder, coalescing into a chorus of long-forgotten details and half-remembered conversations. The detectives listened patiently, sifting through the torrent of memories, searching for the one small detail that might break the case wide open. One particular interview, with an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, who had lived next door to the Jenkins for 30 years, provided the first flicker of a potential lead. She tearfully recalled the day of Art's disappearance, the sudden, unnerving silence that had settled over the neighborhood. She remembered seeing Art arguing with someone earlier that week, a rare and unsettling sight. Art was not a man prone to confrontation. She couldn't remember the man's face, only that he was younger, and that their conversation had seemed heated, their voices raised in anger. At the time, she had dismissed it as a minor disagreement, but now, in the shadow of murder, the memory took on a sinister and new significance. The investigation also delved back into Art's personal and financial life, searching for any hidden conflicts or secret disputes. His financial records were impeccable, his life a model of fiscal responsibility. There were no gambling debts, no secret investments, no signs of any financial distress. He had no known enemies, no business deals gone wrong, but a closer look at the records from the paper mill where he had worked revealed a small but significant discrepancy. A few months before his disappearance, Art, in his role as the company accountant, had flagged an irregularity in the books, a series of unauthorized withdrawals that pointed to an internal theft. He had reported his suspicions to his superiors, an act of integrity that may have unwittingly sealed his fate. This new lead sent the detectives down a rabbit hole of corporate records and old employee files. They discovered that the internal investigation at the paper mill had been quietly shut down shortly after Art's disappearance, the official reason cited as insufficient evidence. The man at the center of the internal theft allegations, a young and ambitious junior executive named Richard Blackwood, had resigned from the company just a few weeks after Art had vanished. He had moved away from Oakhaven shortly after, severing all ties with his former life. The detectives felt a familiar thrill of the hunt, a gut feeling that they were finally on the right track. The forensic evidence from the metal toolbox began to yield its own secrets. The fingerprints lifted from its surface were run through the national database, and a match was found. The prints belonged to Richard Blackwood, a man with no prior criminal record, a man who had seemingly disappeared off the face of the earth 15 years ago. The scratch on the side of the toolbox, a seemingly insignificant detail, was matched to a photograph from a 2008 company picnic, a photo that showed Richard Blackwood standing next to a nearly identical toolbox, a proud smile. On his face, the whispers of yesterday were now a roar, a deafening chorus of evidence that all pointed to one man. The re-examination of the original witness statements also revealed a chilling and overlooked detail. Several neighbors had mentioned seeing a dark blue sedan parked on a side street near the Jenkins home on the day of Art's disappearance. At the time, it had seemed insignificant, just another car in a quiet suburban neighborhood, but a check of the DMV records from 2008 revealed that Richard Blackwood had owned a dark blue sedan, a car he had sold just weeks after Art vanished. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, forming a dark and disturbing picture of a crime born of desperation and greed. The detectives now had a prime suspect, a motive, and a growing mountain of physical evidence. The hunt for Richard Blackwood, the man who had seemingly gotten away with murder for 15 years, was now on. They discovered that he had been living a quiet, unassuming life in a small town in Oregon, under a new name, with a new family who had no idea about the dark secrets of his past. The ghost of Art Jenkins was about to reach out from the grave, its bony fingers pointing directly at the man who had so brutally taken his life. The quiet whispers of yesterday had finally led them to their killer. The stage was now set for a confrontation, a final act in a tragedy that had played out over 15 long years. The detectives from the small town of Oakhaven were about to travel across the country, to bring a killer to justice, and to finally give a grieving family the closure they so desperately deserved. The quiet suburban dream of Oakhaven had been shattered by a brutal act of violence, but the pursuit of justice, a force as relentless and unwavering as the changing of the seasons, was about to have its day. The whispers of yesterday had done their work, and now it was time for the thunder of justice. The discovery that their prime suspect, Richard Blackwood, was living under an assumed name in a sleepy Oregon town presented a new set of challenges. For Detective Rossi and her team, they were dealing with a man who had successfully reinvented himself, a ghost who had spent 15 years meticulously erasing his past. To catch him, they would have to be just as meticulous, just as patient. They couldn't risk tipping him off, giving him the chance to disappear again, to slip through their fingers like a phantom. The ghost in the machine, as they began to call him, was a cunning and elusive adversary, and they knew they would only get one chance to bring him down. The first step was to build an airtight case, a fortress of evidence so strong that it would be impossible for Blackwood to deny his guilt. They painstakingly re-examined every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every forensic report. They created a detailed timeline of the days leading up to Art's murder, cross-referenced Blackwood's known movements with the events at the paper mill and the sightings of his dark blue sedan. The picture that emerged was of a man in a state of quiet desperation, a man whose ambition had led him down a dark and treacherous path. The internal theft at the paper mill had been his get-rich-quick scheme, a way to fund the lavish lifestyle he so desperately craved that the forensic evidence from the metal toolbox was the cornerstone of their case. The fingerprints, the DNA, the unique scratch, each detail was a nail in Blackwood's coffin. They were able to trace the purchase of the toolbox to a specific hardware store in a neighboring town, a store that had kept its sales records for over 2 decades. A review of those records revealed that Richard Blackwood had purchased the exact same model of toolbox just 3 days before Art Jenkins disappeared. It was a stunning piece of corroborating evidence, a link that tied Blackwood directly to the murder weapon and the makeshift coffin. The detectives also delved deeper into Blackwood's life. After he had left Oakhaven, they discovered a pattern of deception and manipulation. A man who had a talent for charming his way into people's lives and then disappearing when things got too complicated. He had left a trail of broken hearts and empty bank accounts in his wake, a ghost who fed on the trust and goodwill of others. His new life in Oregon was a carefully constructed facade, a house of cards that was about to come crashing down. He had a wife, 2 children, a respectable job as a financial planner, a life that was a mirror image of the one he had so violently destroyed 15 years earlier. The most chilling discovery came from an old, discarded computer that had belonged to Blackwood. It had been found in a dumpster behind his old apartment in Oakhaven, a piece of electronic refuse that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. A team of forensic computer experts was able to recover a series of deleted files, a digital ghost that had been haunting the machine for 15 years. Among the recovered files was a series of emails between Blackwood and an unknown accomplice, a shadowy figure who had helped him plan the murder and dispose of the body. The emails were a cold and calculating blueprint for a perfect crime, a crime that had almost succeeded. The identity of the accomplice, however, remained a mystery. The emails were encrypted, the sender's identity hidden behind a wall of code. But the content of the messages was horrifyingly clear. They spoke of Art Jenkins as a problem that needed to be taken care of, a loose end that had to be tied up. They discussed the best way to dispose of the body, the best way to cover their tracks. The discovery of these emails transformed the case from a single perpetrator homicide to a conspiracy, a dark and twisted plot that had been hatched in the shadows. The ghost in the machine was not working alone. With the evidence against Blackwood now overwhelming, Detective Rossi and her team prepared to make their move. They obtained a warrant for his arrest and began to coordinate with the local police department in Oregon. The operation had to be executed with military precision. Swift and silent takedown that would give Blackwood no time to react. The element of surprise was their greatest weapon, their only defense against a man who had proven himself to be a master of evasion and deceit. The long arm of the law was about to reach across the country to pluck a ghost from his carefully constructed new life and drag him back into the light. The day of the arrest was a tense and nerve-wracking affair. Detective Rossi and her team flew to Oregon, their minds focused on the task at hand. They briefed the local officers, their faces grim and determined. They knew that they were about to shatter the lives of an innocent woman and her 2 children, to reveal the monster that had been living in their midst. It was a heavy burden to bear, but it was a necessary one. The pursuit of justice often leaves a trail of collateral damage in its wake, a painful but unavoidable consequence of unearthing the truth. The takedown was a swift and efficient operation. They surrounded Blackwood's house in the pre-hours, a silent and formidable presence in the quiet suburban street. They moved in quickly, their movements practiced and precise. Blackwood was arrested without incident, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. The ghost in the machine had finally been captured, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The 15-year-old mystery of the grandfather who vanished while mowing his lawn was one step closer to being solved. The arrest of Richard Blackwood sent a new wave of shock and disbelief through Oakhaven. The man who had once been a promising young executive, a respected member of the community, was now a suspected murderer. The whispers of yesterday, the long-forgotten rumors and suspicions, now seemed like a prescient warning that had gone unheeded. The town was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that a killer had walked among them, his dark secret hidden behind a friendly smile and a firm handshake. The ghost in the machine had been unmasked, and the full, horrifying story of Art Jenkins' murder was about to be told. The interrogation of Richard Blackwood began in a small, windowless room in the Oakhaven Police Department, the air thick with the unspoken weight of 15 years of silence. Blackwood, now a man in his late 40s, his once youthful ambition replaced by a quiet and unsettling calmness, sat across from Detective Rossi, his hands cuffed in front of him. He was a shadow of the man he had once been, a ghost brought back to the scene of his crime. His initial response to the accusations was a cool and practiced denial, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. He claimed to have no memory of Art Jenkins, no knowledge of the paper mill, no connection to the quiet town of Oakhaven. He was a master of deception, a man who had had 15 years to perfect his story. Detective Rossi, however, was not easily swayed. She was a patient and methodical interrogator. Her questions a slow and steady drip that was designed to erode even the most carefully constructed facade. She began by laying out the evidence, piece by painstaking piece. She showed him the photograph of the toolbox, the sales record from the hardware store, the fingerprints that were a perfect match to his own. With each new piece of evidence, a small crack appeared in Blackwood's armor of denial, a flicker of fear in his eyes, a slight tremor in his hand, a bead of sweat on his brow, the telltale signs of a man whose world was unraveling. The turning point came when Rossi played the audio recordings of the recovered emails, the cold and calculating words of a killer filling the small interrogation room, the sound of his own voice, or rather, the voice of the man he had been 15 years ago, seemed to be the final blow. Carefully constructed walls of his denial came crashing down, and the shadow of a man sitting across from Detective Rossi finally broke. A torrent of words, a confession that had been dammed up for 15 years, came pouring out, a river of guilt, regret, and a chillingly casual account of a brutal and senseless murder. Blackwood admitted to the theft at the paper mill, a crime born of a desperate desire to escape the suffocating confines of his small-town life. He had seen the wealth and success of the executives around him, and he had wanted it for himself, a shortcut to the American dream. Art Jenkins, with his meticulous attention to detail and his unwavering integrity, had been an unexpected obstacle in his path. Art had discovered the discrepancies in the books, and he had confronted Blackwood, giving him a chance to come clean, to make things right. But Blackwood, blinded by his ambition and terrified of the consequences, had seen only one way out. He described the events of that fateful August afternoon with a chilling and detached clarity. He had gone to Art's house under the pretense of wanting to talk, to explain himself. He had found Art in the backyard, mowing his lawn, a picture of quiet, suburban contentment. They had argued, their voices raised in the sweltering heat. Art had threatened to go to the police, to expose Blackwood's crime. In that moment, a switch had flipped in Blackwood's mind. A surge of rage, a primal fear of being caught, had overwhelmed him. He had grabbed a nearby garden gnome, a cheerful and kitschy lawn ornament, and he had struck Art from behind, again and again, until the old man lay still on the freshly cut grass. The confession was a brutal and horrifying account of a crime that was both senseless and tragic. It was the story of a life cut short, a family torn apart, a community shattered by an act of violence that was born of greed and desperation. Blackwood, in a state of panic and adrenaline, had dragged Art's body to the garage, where he had found the metal toolbox. He had crammed the body inside, a grotesque and brutal act of concealment. He had then dug a shallow grave under the old oak tree, a place where he hoped the body would never be found. He had cleaned up the scene with a cold and methodical precision, leaving no trace of the violence that had just occurred. He also confessed to the existence of an accomplice, a man he would only identify as a friend. This friend, he claimed, had helped him plan the murder and had provided him with a new identity, a new life in Oregon. He refused to give a name, a last-ditch effort to protect the one person who had been his partner in crime. The ghost in the machine, it seemed, was still loyal to its creator, but the confession had provided the detectives with a new and crucial piece of the puzzle. a new lead to follow in their quest for justice. The Shadow had confessed, but the story was not yet over. The news of Blackwood's confession brought a sense of grim satisfaction to the town of Oakhaven. The man who had haunted their community for 15 years was finally behind bars. His dark secret brought out into the light. For Eleanor Jenkins and her children, the confession was a painful but necessary step towards closure. They finally knew what had happened to their beloved husband and father. The horrific details of his final moments. The not knowing had been a special kind of torture, and now, at last, they had an answer. However brutal and heartbreaking it might be, the confession also solved a small but poignant mystery that had lingered for 15 years. The half-mown lawn, the abandoned pitcher of iced tea. These were the details that had so haunted Eleanor. Blackwood's account explained it all. He had interrupted Art in the middle of his weekend ritual, a ritual that had been so cruelly and senselessly cut short. The confession was a testament to the fragility of life, the way in which a quiet, ordinary day can be shattered in an instant by an act of unimaginable violence. With Blackwood's confession, the first chapter of the Art Jenkins murder case was closed, but a new chapter was just beginning. The hunt for the accomplice, the shadowy figure who had helped Blackwood get away with murder, was now the top priority for Detective Rossi and her team. They knew that they could not rest until everyone involved in this heinous crime was brought to justice. The confession of a shadow had led them to one killer, but another one was still out there, a ghost who was still hiding in the shadows, waiting to be unmasked. The confession, videotaped and transcribed, was a chilling and powerful document, a testament to the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary life. It was a story that would be told and retold, a cautionary tale about the corrosive power of greed and the devastating consequences of a single, fateful decision. The grandfather who had vanished while mowing his lawn had finally been given a voice that cried out from the grave for justice, a voice that would not be silenced until the whole truth was finally known. Richard Blackwood's confession had exorcised one ghost from the quiet town of Oakhaven, but it had summoned another, the identity of his accomplice. The shadowy figure who had helped him plan the murder and escape justice became the new obsession. For Detective Rossi and her team, Blackwood, in a twisted display of loyalty, refused to name his partner in crime, leaving the detectives with a frustrating and tantalizing mystery. They had the confession of one killer, but they knew that justice would not be truly served until the second ghost was also brought out of the shadows and into the harsh light of accountability. The investigation into the identity of the accomplice began with the encrypted emails that had been recovered from Blackwood's old computer. A team of cybersecurity experts was brought in, their task to crack the code that had shielded the second ghost's identity for 15 years. It was a slow and painstaking process, a digital cat-and-mouse game with a ghost who had been very careful to cover his tracks. The detectives knew that the key to unlocking this new mystery lay hidden in the ones and zeros of that old, discarded machine. While the tech experts worked their digital magic, Detective Rossi and her team went back to the old-fashioned methods of police work. They re-interviewed Blackwood's former colleagues from the paper mill, his friends, his family, anyone who might have had a connection to him in the months leading up to Art's murder. They were searching for a name, a face, a connection that might lead them to the second ghost. They knew that he had to be someone Blackwood trusted, someone who was just as ruthless and calculating as he was. Their investigation led them to a man named David Miller, a former IT specialist at the paper mill, who had been a close friend of Blackwood's. Miller had left the company shortly after Blackwood, moving to a different state and seemingly disappearing off the grid. He was a quiet and unassuming man, a computer whiz who was known for his love of puzzles and codes. The detectives felt a familiar thrill of the hunt, a gut feeling that they were on the right track. The second ghost, it seemed, was a man who was comfortable living in the digital shadows. A background check on David Miller revealed a series of troubling details. He had a history of minor financial crimes, a pattern of small-scale fraud and embezzlement that had gone largely unnoticed. He was a man who lived on the fringes, a ghost who had a talent for manipulating systems and exploiting loopholes. He was the perfect partner for a man like Blackwood, a man who could provide the technical expertise and the moral ambiguity that was needed to pull off a perfect crime. The breakthrough came when the cybersecurity team finally managed to decrypt the emails, the sender's IP address, masked by a series of sophisticated rerouting techniques. was traced back to a public library in a town just a few miles from Oakhaven. A review of the library's security footage from that time, a grainy and faded video that had been stored in a dusty archive, revealed a stunning and damning piece of evidence. The man at the computer, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap, was unmistakably David Miller. The second ghost had a face, a name, and a digital footprint that led directly to him. With the evidence against Miller now overwhelming, Detective Rossi and her team prepared to make their second arrest. They discovered that he was living a quiet and reclusive life in a remote cabin in Montana, a ghost who had sought refuge in the vast and empty wilderness. The arrest was another swift and efficient operation, a silent takedown that left Miller with no time to escape. The second ghost, the man who had been the architect of the perfect crime, was finally in custody. The interrogation of David Miller was a stark contrast to the one with Richard Blackwood. Miller, a man who had spent his life hiding behind a computer screen, was not a skilled liar. He was a nervous and twitchy man, his eyes darting around the room as if he was looking for an escape route. He crumbled almost immediately under the weight of the evidence, his confession a torrent of fear and regret. He admitted to his role in the conspiracy, his voice barely a whisper. He had been the one who had come up with the plan, the one who had provided Blackwood with the technical know-how to cover his tracks. He explained that he had been in deep financial trouble at the time, his gambling debts spiraling out of control. Blackwood's offer of a share of the stolen money had been a temptation he couldn't resist. He had seen it as a victimless crime, a way to solve his financial problems without getting his hands dirty. But the plan had quickly escalated, and he had found himself trapped in a web of his own making. He had helped Blackwood create a new identity, a new life, a way to escape the consequences of their actions. He had been a ghost in the machine, a silent partner in a crime that had haunted him for 15 years. The arrest and confession of David Miller brought a new and final chapter to the Art Jenkins murder case. The conspiracy had been unraveled. The two ghosts who had haunted Oakhaven for so long finally brought to justice. The news of the second arrest was a relief to the community, a final and definitive answer to a question that had lingered for so long. The grandfather who had vanished while mowing his lawn had been the victim of a cold and calculated plot, a crime that had been born of greed and a shocking disregard for human life. The trial of Richard Blackwood and David Miller was a media sensation, a courtroom drama that captivated the nation. The two men, once partners in crime, now sat on opposite sides of the courtroom, their faces a mask of grim resignation. The evidence against them was overwhelming, the testimony of the witnesses and the forensic experts painting a dark and damning picture of their guilt. The jury's verdict was swift and unanimous, guilty on all counts. The two ghosts were sentenced to life in prison, their final act a slow and lonely fade into the anonymity of the penal system. The second ghost had been unmasked, and the story of Art Jenkins' murder had finally reached its just and tragic conclusion. The convictions of Richard Blackwood and David Miller brought a sense of closure to the town of Oakhaven, but the scars of that fateful August afternoon remained. The idyllic image of Maple Street, with its manicured lawns and friendly neighbors, had been irrevocably shattered. The story of Art Jenkins, the grandfather who had been murdered and buried in his own backyard, was now woven into the very fabric of the town's history, a dark and cautionary tale that would be passed down through generations. The peace of the quiet suburban street had been restored, but it was a fragile peace, a peace that was forever tinged with the memory of a brutal and senseless crime. For the Miller family, the discovery of Art's remains in their backyard was a trauma that would take years to overcome. Their dream of a quiet, idyllic life had been transformed into a living nightmare. They eventually sold the house, unable to shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air, the sense that they were living on haunted ground. The old oak tree, once a symbol of strength and endurance, now seemed to cast a long and sinister shadow over the property, a silent and solemn witness to the horror that had taken place beneath its branches. The scars of Maple Street were not just emotional, they were etched into the very landscape of the neighborhood. Eleanor Jenkins, in her final years, found a measure of peace in the knowledge that her husband's killers had been brought to justice. The not knowing had been a heavy burden to bear, and the truth, however painful, had finally set her free. She spent her remaining days surrounded by her children and grandchildren, her heart filled with a mixture of grief and a quiet, resilient strength. She had lost the love of her life, but she had never lost her capacity for love. her ability to find joy in the simple and beautiful moments of life. She passed away peacefully in her sleep, her heart finally at rest, her spirit reunited with the man she had loved for so long. The community of Oak Haven, in the years that followed the trial, made a conscious effort to heal the wounds of the past. The annual memorial for Arch Jenkins, once a somber and mournful affair, was transformed into a celebration of his life, a tribute to the kind and gentle man who had been a pillar of their community. They planted a new oak tree in the park, a symbol of new beginnings, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They created a scholarship in Art's name, a fund that would help young people from Oak Haven pursue their dreams, a legacy of hope and opportunity that would live on for generations to come. The story of Art Jenkins' murder also had a lasting impact on the Oak Haven Police Department. The case became a textbook example of the importance of cold case investigations, a testament to the power of perseverance and the relentless pursuit of justice. It was a reminder that no case is ever truly closed, that the whispers of the past can sometimes lead to the most unexpected and dramatic of breakthroughs. Detective Isabella Rossi, for her role in solving the case, was promoted to Chief of Police, her name becoming synonymous with integrity and a fierce and unwavering commitment to the truth. The two men responsible for the tragedy, Richard Blackwood and David Miller, would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, their names forever linked to a crime that had shocked a nation. They were the living embodiment of the corrosive power of greed, a cautionary tale about the dark and treacherous path that can lead a person to commit the most heinous of acts. They were the ghosts who had haunted Oak Haven for so long, their final act a slow and lonely fade into the obscurity of the prison system. The scars they had inflicted on Maple Street would never fully disappear, but they would serve as a constant reminder of the importance of justice, compassion, and the enduring power of a community to heal and to remember. The red lawnmower, one that had sat abandoned in the middle of a half-mown lawn on that hot August afternoon, was never seen again. It had been given away, a relic of a past that was too painful to remember. But the sound of a lawnmower on a quiet Saturday afternoon would forever be a poignant and bittersweet reminder of the man who had loved his yard, his family, and his community with a quiet and unwavering devotion. The silence that had fallen over Maple Street on that day had finally been filled, not with the roar of an engine, but with the quiet and steady hum of a community that had found a way to move forward, to heal, and to never forget. The story of Art Jenkins is a story about the fragility of life, the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary world, and the enduring power of hope and resilience. It is a story that reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, the human spirit can find a way to heal, to rebuild, and to create a future that is brighter than the past. The scars of Maple Street were deep and painful, but they were also a testament to the strength and courage of a community that had refused to be defined by a single act of violence. And so, the quiet suburban street of Maple Street continued on, its rhythm of life restored, its residents forever changed. By the events of that fateful summer, the children who had once played in the shadow of a murder investigation grew up, their own laughter filling the air that had once been thick with grief and suspicion. The story of Art Jenkins became a part of their history, a tale that was told with a mixture of sadness and a quiet sense of pride in a community that had faced the darkness and had emerged, stronger and more united, on the other side. The final scar of Maple Street was not one of sadness, but of remembrance. It was the understanding that life is precious, that community is a powerful and sacred thing, and that the pursuit of justice, no matter how long it takes, is a noble and worthy endeavor. The grandfather who had vanished while mowing his lawn had been found, his story had been told, and his memory had been honored. The scars of Maple Street were a testament to a life that had been tragically cut short, but also to a love and a community that would endure forever. In the quiet aftermath of the trials and the media frenzy, a new and unexpected story began to emerge from the scarred landscape of Maple Street. It was a story that unfolded not in the stark, fluorescent light of an interrogation room or the hallowed halls of a courtroom, but in the gentle, dappled sunlight of a well-tended garden. The Miller family, having sold the house on Maple Street, had moved to a new home on the other side of town, seeking a fresh start, a place where the earth held no dark secrets. The old Jenkins house, with its tragic history, sat empty for a time, a silent monument to the events that had transpired there. a young couple, new to Oakhaven and unaware of the full, gruesome details of the property's past, eventually bought the house. They were drawn by its charm, its spacious backyard, and the sense of peace that seemed to have finally settled over the neighborhood. They were a quiet and unassuming couple, and they quickly became a welcome addition to the community. The wife, a woman with a passion for gardening, began the slow and patient process of transforming the backyard, her hands working the soil that had once been a crime scene, a place of death and concealment. She had heard the whispers, of course, the vague and unsettling stories about the previous owners and the grim discovery that had been made in the backyard. But she was not a woman who was easily swayed by rumor or superstition. She saw the yard not as a place of darkness, but as a place of potential, a place that could be brought back to life with a little bit of love and a lot of hard work. She planted new flowers, their vibrant colors a stark and beautiful contrast to the dark history of the soil. She nurtured the old oak tree, its branches now providing a gentle and welcome shade. One day, as she was working in the garden, she noticed an elderly man standing on the sidewalk, his gaze fixed on her house. He was a familiar figure in the neighborhood, a man who was often seen taking long, solitary walks, his face etched with a quiet and gentle sadness. She had always assumed he was just another friendly neighbor, but there was something about the way he looked at her house, a look of profound and personal connection, that piqued her curiosity. She offered him a friendly wave, and he responded with a small, hesitant smile. He introduced himself as a friend of the Jenkins family, a man who had known Art and Eleanor for many years. He spoke of Art's love for his garden, the pride he had taken in his perfectly manicured lawn, the joy he had found in the simple act of making things grow. He told her stories of the old neighborhood, of the potluck dinners and the summer barbecues, of the sense of community that had once been so strong on Maple Street. As he spoke, the young woman began to see her house not as a place of tragedy, but as a place of love, a place that had once been filled with happiness and laughter. The old man, whose name was George, became a regular visitor to her garden. He would bring her small gifts, a rare and beautiful flower from his own garden, a bag of his special blend of fertilizer, a piece of advice on how to deal with the stubborn clay soil. He never spoke of the murder, of the dark and violent act that had taken place just a few feet from where they stood. He spoke only of life, of growth, of the quiet and enduring power of nature to heal and to regenerate. He was an unseen gardener, a man who was quietly and patiently tending to the emotional landscape of a neighborhood that had been so deeply wounded. The young woman, inspired by George's stories and his gentle and unwavering kindness, decided to create a small memorial garden in a quiet corner of her backyard. It was a simple and understated tribute, a small plaque with Art's name and a collection of his favorite flowers. It was a place of peace and reflection, a place where the memory of the man who had loved this garden so much could live on. The unseen gardener had planted a seed of remembrance, a seed that would blossom into a beautiful and lasting tribute. The memorial garden became a quiet and sacred space for the residents of Maple Street. They would often see George there, sitting on the small wooden bench, his eyes closed, a faint smile on his face. He was a silent and constant presence, a guardian of a memory that was too precious to be forgotten. He was the unseen gardener, the man who had taken it upon himself to ensure that the legacy of Art Jenkins was not one of violence and tragedy, but one of love, kindness, and a deep and abiding connection to the earth. And so, the story of the grandfather who vanished while mowing his lawn came to its final, poignant conclusion. It was a story that had begun with an act of unimaginable violence, a story that had been filled with grief, suspense, and the relentless pursuit of justice. But in the end, it was a story about the enduring power of community, the resilience of the human spirit, and the quiet and often unseen acts of kindness that can heal even the deepest of wounds. The unseen gardener had shown them that even in the darkest of places, life can find a way to bloom again. The final image of this story is not of a crime scene, not of a courtroom, not of a prison cell. It is the image of a quiet and beautiful garden, a place of peace and remembrance, a testament to the man who had loved it so much. It is the image of an old man, an unseen gardener, sitting on a bench, his heart filled with the memories of a friend, his spirit at peace in the knowledge that he had done his part to keep that memory alive. The scars of Maple Street had finally begun to fade, replaced by the vibrant and beautiful colors of a garden that had been brought back to life by the gentle and loving hands of an unseen gardener.